Good morning, or whatever it is where you are, and I hope you're having a great day, and this just adds to it. This is What Was Jesus Really Up To? And I'm Scott Daniels, and I don't pretend to have all the answers to that question, but what our goal today would be is to draw out what I think is a golden thread, you might say, from Jesus, that has often got lost in the tapestry of Christianity. It's certainly part of our Christian tradition, but you'd have to say the whole tradition. In other words, some of it didn't necessarily make it into orthodoxy. And so we're going to try to gain eyes to see and ears to hear what Jesus was really up to, mainly through this golden thread. And thank you for being with me to do this. It's great to do it together. I'm going to use PowerPoint, but I know you can't read probably most of what's going to be up there, but you can see the pictures, and often they are worth 1,000 words, and I'm going to try to keep my words to a minimum, so hopefully it's not distracting to use the PowerPoint too. So anyway, I was out cross-country skiing last week thinking about this and actually all sorts of things. I was kind of in monkey mind mode, you might say. And then I realized this is silly. This is a chance to be open to God and saying, sorry Lord, I just really wasn't open, so I just thought, well, try to open up now, be present, and then I heard just sit down, and thought there's no place to sit. Then I looked over, and sure enough, there was a stump. So I took off my skis and sat down, took some deep breaths, and then I saw this tree across from me. You can't probably make it out well, but it had been utterly destroyed by a woodpecker, and that's really what I saw at first. I even had that thought, wow, that woodpecker just destroyed that tree. I mean, it's like, that's kind of sad, but then I heard, or a sentence in my head, a complete thing that I'm still actually learning from. I just heard, she has fed thousands of my little ones and helped them feed each other. Now she, this tree, will help you to see something, including the role of the woodpecker. That her influence is waning does not diminish my love or appreciation for her. And then I was like, oh, of course, So again, like a shift, just settling down. This is how nature works, and in fact, that tree is part of a cycle that is beautiful, a creative cycle. The thousands would be all the little bugs and stuff, but then they fed the woodpecker, and then, so there's this whole beautiful cycle of which the woodpecker's part, and I was just like, of course, see the beauty in it, see the organic nature of how God does create and give life, and death is part of that, all that stuff, So I was thinking that way when I noticed the branch. I don't know if you can see it there. There's a branch that was actually closer to me, actually makes it look like a cross. And so then I got up and I was like, oh, maybe there's more to this. And as I was skiing back to the parking lot, this is sort of I'll just sum up what I ended up thinking. And that is, the cross has helped to feed billions as people have been inspired by the love Jesus offered there. And sincerely, I don't want to mess any of that up. So any of the ways you've gone to the cross, if you have, if it has fed you, in other words, Christianity in a particular way, please keep going and keep being fed in those ways. Let what we do today just be addition, not subtraction. And hopefully it'll add something that'll enrich that journey. And if it hasn't really fed you, then hopefully there'll be an opportunity here for really being fed and coming into healing and wholeness and in an organic way, because that really is what this is about, being open to the Spirit behind and within all of life, which is my main image for God. Well, this is a map of that area that I was skiing in, and it's kind of funny that the map has all the trails. I mean, all the trails on the map are there, I should say that. But here's the problem. It doesn't have all the trails that exist in the park. So I ended up taking one earlier than I should have, a fork in the road, because I figured, well, there's only one on the map, right? Well, there were two, actually. That I took one of them and ended up going up in circles trying to go to this one place. And it made me laugh. And I thought of an analogy for Christianity, and that is, a complex system got set up. I'm going to call it churchianity. And its ideas and structure can distract us from what Jesus really said to do. And that is, go to God knowing that God loves you. Let God get to you, right? That's that, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then love others as yourself. Then get to loving, right? And that's what really worship is all about, seeing the worth of God's love first and foremost, and then seeing it as the treasure in your life, your desire, because we're created in the image of God, to be about that kind of love, and then go out into your life, your love, life being in love. That's what we want to say, right? In the love of God. One of my favorite lines in the book of Jude is, keep yourself in the love of God. Paul says, let the love of God rule your hearts. This is really the first goal, and this is what Jesus was trying to get people to. But often, all the stuff going on in Christianity, it can distract us from that very goal. And it's just human. It's human stuff. But we want to try to get, again, to that golden thread. So, let's look at some of the things that traditional Christianity is actually missing that are part of the old tradition. Studies in the 20th century really found there's about 20 other sources that had pretty good traditions around them. You can't read the list there, and there's lots of good books on this. The one I want to focus on is the Gospel of Thomas. And the Jesus Seminar concluded that it should be included in our canon. It should be our Bible, they said. They published a book called The Five Gospels. You may not agree with that. I don't know if I do, because it's kind of weird. But there is some material in there that just seems vintage Jesus and very early material. And here's a couple thoughts here. One was, Jesus said, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all. And after they have reigned, they will rest. That describes my journey pretty well. The journey home with God, right? Okay. Here's another one that Jesus said. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. Very organic. Part of that spirit behind and within all of life is the idea here. And this is something Christianity in many ways sort of lost. In other words, that organic way God does create, and how to really be open to that. I think this is part of why St. Francis is so popular, and for good reason. He got back in touch with that, brother, sun, sister, moon, that we need to reclaim that part of God that is Mother Nature, right? So that's part of the journey. Gospel Thomas has a pretty good feel for that in some ways. Other ways, maybe not so much, but we need to gain a feel for that again, like St. Francis did, to really be open to, the God in whom we live and move and have our being, is the way Paul talks about it in Acts 17. So anyway, here's a little way of getting at it in a fun way. The situation, so in Saturday morning cartoons, right, it just says here, it's sad how Wile E. Coyote is remembered for his violence and not for his brilliant paintings of tunnels. I think about when he used to paint those tunnels so fast, and yet they were, perfect, right? Well, this is what we want to talk about, that Jesus is primarily remembered for the violence done to him on the cross and his amazing response and resurrection, and not so much for his brilliant way in truth, the way he lived in his relationship with God that led him to be able to do that, bringing the light of God through in miraculous ways, where the line between the divine and human was lost in him. And he's remembered for how he was interpreted as a religious figure in his time, and then the icon that figure became, right? Think about 1700 years really, or maybe 2000, what we'll talk about there, that the church kept forming this icon. And that sometimes gets in the way of really seeing the daily life way in truth he was inviting us to. So, let alone, when you think about the things we miss when it comes to Jesus, is, let alone the way he was a person like us. He was human. He had feelings. He had needs. He had to live life a day at a time, like any normal person, right? With those desires and joys and sorrows that are part of life. Our professor, when I was in Israel in 1991, he said, if you can't imagine Jesus going to the bathroom, you've lost touch with his humanity. Kind of shocking, but it made his point, and he's right, Jesus was human, and he brought the divine through in ways that line between the two was lost. So we should ask, what were the daily life realities Jesus was dealing with as a man in Israel in the first century? What was Jesus addressing as a spiritual leader? What was he really up to? And what's his gift for us today? So here's a funny shot. When I asked where this village was in session the other night, some people thought Wisconsin, and that's kind of, but it's actually Jerusalem, 2013. See the snow? They had almost a foot of snow, and that picture there I think is from like a house, and so the angle on the house or the car is funny, but lots of snow. Well, that's interesting. And then when I was there in '91, this was Nazareth, and it's this beautiful mountain town. Not huge mountains, but certainly a hill town. And as we were driving from there to the Jordan River, there was a van that had snow on it. And this guy had been in a little bit higher mountains in Israel. And so I went over anyway, and I made a little snowball, and I was tossing it, and I said to our professor, you know, did Jesus throw snowballs? What do you think? And he said, definitely. Well, that blew my mind. I realized I've got to bracket my assumptions. I had always seen him as growing up in the desert, lots of sand, hot all the time, you know, that whole thing. And the reality is quite different. So how to be open to the realities that were there in Jesus' time. And that's what I really want us to try to be open to. Keep that beginner's mind, open mind, as we look at this. And we'll talk about what the situation was. So you have the world of antiquity and then the modern world. That's the two worlds on the screen behind you. I know you can't read it. We'll just kind of go through the ideas. Always in the world, there's these elemental forces, these elemental creative forces, right? That's just part of life, organic forces, right? And they raise all these questions, right? The issues, I love how Scott Peck talks about it. He says, sex, money, and in-laws are problems for everybody at some point. Throw survival in there and you got it covered, I think. In other words, you know, family system stuff, all that stuff, the just stuff of life, well, those raise questions for all of us as human beings, right? And the world of antiquity really was open to answers for those areas in the mysterious and spiritual. That was a big, big area for answers. But of course, questions needed to be sorted out for society, and so ancient religions formed, and the Hebrew religion developed a whole system. And that's where you see up here the notion of the creation and fall, which actually we see that story throughout religions in different ways, even all the way with a flood, that whole thing. But then the Hebrews came up with a system of atonement, primarily through sacrifice. And the idea was basically that to get back right with God, you had to do certain things, very conditional, right? And one thing is be humble, and that's exactly right. But the idea of making sacrifice, kind of paying a debt whenever you did something wrong to get back with God, that was the mentality. And in fact, that mentality was very well entrenched by the time of Jesus, probably had been there for a good 1,000 years. And then the temple was in many ways a climax of that, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But anyway, so you get questions out of that too. And so you get the New Testament trying to answer those questions, and then that gives birth really to a whole different worldview, right? And that starts with the Edict of Milan, when the Emperor Constantine decided to first give authenticity or permission to the Christian religion, but then by 325 and the Council of Nicaea, he wanted it to be the state religion. Well, that's interesting. Now the state gets involved in codifying Christianity and all the forces of the state. That's the thing we want to be aware of, right? He's going to use it to push his agenda of the state. Well, that is a blessing and a curse, isn't it? And that's certainly what happened. But that's sort of the birth of what you might call churchianity, right? A lot of good in there, but a lot of not so good. A lot of the state stuff, right? The ways of the world, okay? Which we're still, of course, dealing with. And it's just human. No one's fault, but part of the institution. So how to sift through that and get that golden thread. That's what we're really trying to do here. Well, you get then 2,000 years of churchianity, or 1,700 years, however you want to think about it. But then you also get the modern world born of this, and you get a bunch of things going on. Like science starts developing, especially in the Enlightenment, Renaissance periods, these sorts of things. And science gets great answers to questions, especially physicality and material things. But the very process leading to that, those answers, often push down the mysterious and the spiritual, and those elemental forces, you might say, of life. So it's engaging in a certain way, but pushing down certain perspectives, the mysterious and spiritual, almost to where there's a wall. So the modern world is not good with the mysterious and spiritual. It just really isn't. Here's an example, okay? In the Bible, certainly, dreams and visions were ways God led people, and then angels spoke to people, clearly, okay, in the Bible. Well, now, if someone hears voices in their head, right, or they're trying to listen to visions or pay attention to visions and dreams to guide their life, people look at them as they're kind of crazy, right? Well, how is God going to get through to us if three of the main ways that are even biblical aren't even honored in our society now or in churches? You know, that's one of the places we should really be honoring these things and do what Paul said. Test the spirits, make sure they're of God, make sure they're of love. They're going to be of love. But it might be, right, a little mysterious, a little even weird. You know, think about Moses responding to a burning bush. Well, that's weird, right? All sorts of, they're weird, but they're ways God is beckoning us into a closer relationship with God. And to keep moving with that is one of the main things Jesus was inviting us to do. All right, so we're going to look at that and try to get to this gift that he was trying to invite us to. So as we go to the next one then, we're going to look at what happened then in the situation he was dealing with. Well, the temple was the center of that in Jesus' time. So here you see a picture, and there's this is the old city walls around 1910 of Jerusalem. And I know you can't read these things, just look at the pictures. They didn't know where the temple was exactly. They knew it was this area, but at this time they were still assuming, you know, these are just the old city walls. Well, then excavations in the 20th century revealed that actually this picture that I just had up there, that's this wall right here of the temple. And I don't know if you can see my pointer going across there. That's this wall right here, which just blows us away because it's half again as tall to go to the top of the temple, 75 to 100 feet tall. And then we realized, and they found all the corners now of the temple, it was like 5 to 5.5 football fields long, 3 to 3.5 football fields wide, and then 75 to 100 feet tall. It used more stones than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. It was the largest building of its time. We don't hear much about it because it was destroyed within 30 years of being completed by the Romans, right? But here's the thing, is to get the significance of the temple in Jewish life. It was the center, and people believed that God's Spirit was always there in the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was. The Ten Commandments, right, is the idea. Probably gone by then, but they believed that God's Spirit was always there. And that's why at the Western Wall now, or Wailing Wall, people still put in prayers. They feel like that's a direct line to God. Of course, God's Spirit's everywhere, available everywhere, but that the presence is focused there all the time is one of the beliefs. So here's just some more pictures. They show like excavations as of 2013 revealed like 100 mikvahs, or ritual baths, even to go into the temple. In other words, people were taking this very seriously, coming to the temple in many ways. In other words, felt this was very important. But by the time of Jesus, of course, the system had messed it up, and we're going to go over that right now. So Jesus comes, and what he finds is a situation that the Sanhedrin, the rulers of the temple, probably felt very justified in, but it wasn't right, okay? Because the belief in Judaism was that you had to come to the temple to make yourself right with God through sacrifices, but the Sanhedrin had made a deal with the Romans to have money changers. And this is because the Romans had decreed that Roman denarii had to be used throughout Israel. You see those over here, and you see there's always a picture of Caesar on those. Well, that's a graven image. And in Judaism, you can't have graven images. So the Sanhedrin said to the Romans, we will pay you a tax if you will let us change the denarii to Hebrew shekels. The Romans said, okay. Well, by the time of Jesus, that tax, that tribute, was anywhere between 30 cents to 70 cents on the dollar. Think about that for a minute. You come out of your religious devotion to get right with God through sacrifice, to buy a pigeon or a dove or a goat or an unblemished lamb, and you have to buy it there because the Sanhedrin decides, you know, which are worthy sacrifices. You come, you give your dollar, you get back 30 cents to buy your pigeon to be right with God. I mean, it's just a racket. It's ridiculous. It's sick when you get right down to it. How they were taking advantage of people's religious devotion. And so Jesus comes. He overturns the tables of the money changers. He overturns that whole system and says, my house shall be a house of prayer. In other words, communion with God, getting back with God. That's what this is all about. And you actually don't need this whole system. He overturns the whole system. It's very symbolic. Very symbolic. And that's why I picked this picture. We don't know where Golgotha was, but you can see here this artist put it on the mountain, Mount of Olives, facing the temple, as if Jesus is really juxtaposed with the whole system of the temple and offering a new way. And this is actually why Jesus said, you know, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. That, I think, was really his intention, to replace that whole mentality. And that's where I want us to go ahead and take a moment and just think about that very thing. Because he comes at Passover, and I'm going to just pause on this picture. He comes at Passover reenacting the whole Passover thing in terms of the Last Supper, and saying, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This is what we celebrate on Maundy, Thursday. And to really get all the stuff he was talking about with that really replaces the old sacrificial system and the mentality behind it. Because quite frankly, folks, the judgment and the conditionality that was driving all of that is still in many ways governing our world. Think about all the ways things are conditional before we get to loving. And that's what he was trying to replace. Get us to God's unconditional love first, have it ruling our hearts, and then live from there. Alright, so we're going to talk about that in part 2 as we get to what it really means to be Easter people. And I just hope to see you there. Thank you.